Hi everyone and welcome to the Newsagent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Senior Content Executive at Goodlord, and today I'm joined by Sean Hooker, Head of Redress at the Property Redress Scheme. So thank you very much for joining me today, Sean.
Yes, absolutely, Susie. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm sure that many of you out there that are listening and that subscribe to Newsagent, you'll probably know Sean. He contributes regularly to our blog with some great opinion pieces around various hot industry topics of the moment. He's also a regular on our webinars. This is the first podcast recording, though, that you've joined me on. Obviously, you are an expert in a few different areas, as your blogs attest. So I just wondered if, first of all, just to kick us off, you could give us a bit of an introduction in terms of your background and your areas of expertise, Sean.
Well, certainly, Susie. Yeah, well, I've been involved in this game now for 15 years now, directly with the with property. Before that was in insurance, property insurance. You wouldn't be surprised, but basically, I started my career with My Deposits, the tenancy deposit scheme, and when the government decided to make a complaint service, a redress service, mandatory for letting agents, we applied and we were approved as one of the approved schemes, along with the property ombudsman, and at the time there was another one called Ombudsman Services, which are no longer in existence. So there's only two of us at the moment. And what do? We deal with complaints, escalated complaints. That if you have a customer, a landlord, or a tenant, if it's a letting, or a buyer and a seller, you can raise a complaint with us, and we can resolve it as best as we can.
Oh, that's a perfect introduction. I think that we will obviously touch on some of those more specific areas of your expertise. We will be looking at, you've obviously just released your annual reports and things like that, so it would be remiss of us not to have a quick look into that. But we will be covering a couple of topics today. We'll be looking at material information, material disclosure in property listings. We'll be looking at a bit of redress as well, as you just said. Yeah, so to kick us off, Let's take a look at the material information side of things first. It is a topic which you've contributed a blog on previously, but it is obviously in May that things will start to change. So it's quite a timely, it's the right time to discuss it. I know that you're on the steering group of the Improving Material Information in Property Listings project set up by the National Trading Standards. So could you talk us through, first of all, how that conversation evolved, or perhaps why it started, and obviously then how it evolved from there?
Well, I think it's for a long while. National Trading Standards have been very interested in making sure that property agents are aware of their obligations under the consumer protection rights. And one of the things that is very important is what is disclosed to a consumer that allows them to make what's called a material decision to make a transaction. And that material information should be given where humanly possible by an agent. So if they know something or are aware of something, they should make the consumer aware of it. So where does this leave on what's actually happening with this this project? Well, the biggest way that people get to learn about where properties are when they want to rent or buy is on the portals. And I won't mention their names, but you know them up there. There are three big portals. There's a couple of other little ones that are in operation, and that's where most agents will advertise their properties for sale or for rent. What they put on that is the first thing that somebody sees in order to make a decision whether to go and view that property, whether to make an offer for that property, or ultimately to transact and buy that property. So the portals have always said that they are just but a gateway. They are not the ones that are actively selling. They are just providing a conduit for agents to sell their wares as it is. So it's a little bit like the market pitches, in the old days. So there's still some around there, and all the little stall holders come and they set their pitches up there. They're not responsible for what is being sold or the quality of what's being sold. That's always been their argument. And that legally still stands. However, the government is very adamant that agents are able to comply with the consumer protection rights. It's in the levelling up paper, and they believe that if consumers are better informed, they will make better decisions, and things like house sales will be more efficient and less falls throughs, that there will be less discontent with renters renting property because they will have the information openly and transparently up front. So a working group was set up to come up with a big long list of requirements that we believe that the portals should display, or give the agents the opportunity to display on a property listing. And they've divided those into several areas of importance. The first one is essential information that must be given in all cases. Now, that's fairly obvious what some of these are. Things like the price of a property, the rent, the tenure of a property, and a number of other things that are essential. There will then be followed by that a list of things that are material and very important to disclose, but won't be disclosed need to be disclosed in every case. And then there will be a list coming out, the list C, which will be things that are would make a difference to a transaction, but not in every case. So it's kind of done in a layered view. I've sat on a lot of these committees, and there's practically kind of one every couple of weeks now because we're getting so close. And it's not easy because basically the portals are very reliant on information that is provided to them by the agents. Agents are very reliant on their systems and then their CRMS systems that feed data in. There's a lot of tech behind there where you have to actually have more fields to be put on. So it's quite a big project, and there's quite a tight deadline on getting this part A bit out. Where are we? We are making very good progress, and I think you will see by the deadline that a lot of work has been done. It will start to be as a voluntary basis, but they're looking to make it mandatory in the next 18 months. So it will start off as, yes, the fields are there, fill them in. The portals will then say, you haven't filled them in, and flag that for the consumer. But ultimately, there could come a day when a portal will refuse to list a property that doesn't contain this information. So that was a long explanation, I know.
It was a very good explanation. I think it's necessary, I suppose, because it is something that, as you say, even if it is voluntary initially, it is something that will be coming in, and the agents and landlords and so on will have to adhere to. And correct me if I'm wrong in saying this, but I do think that it's something that, as you said, the Levelling Up white paper, the government has said that if they have to legislate around this, and they will. Do you think that will have to become a requirement? When you say it's mandatory, do you think that the legislation will be required, or will just simply the technical functionality ensure that agents have no choice but to follow it?
I think, at some stage it will become a requirement. And the reason I'm saying that, because there are still practices out there, which I'm not saying are completely wrong, but do not meet the requirement for modern consumer protection. So, for example, one of the things we've been debating is, and it's very, very few, to be honest. I think one of the portals said it was under 1% of agents that do this, but they put up, and they don't put a price up. They put price on inquiry or something like that, or so literally, so that you have to ring up and say, well, actually, how much has the property been put up on the system for? And it's very few agents that do that. However, it doesn't meet the criteria of being open and transparent. So that sort of practice will need to be looked at, and agents will have to realise that that's not what the modern consumer needs or wants. They've done lots of surveys, and all the consumers out there have said that if they had more information, they would find the process easier and less stressful, and it will mean that there will be less complaints, hopefully. So that's what I'm hoping, anyway, from my point of view.
No, of course, that is a good end goal to have, and I believe as well that it is intended to be beneficial to all parties. I do think that it's something that at the minute there seems to be a bit of a lack of clarity, so it does make it difficult for agents to perhaps know the extent of the information that they should provide. So, in theory, this is going to be beneficial and advantageous to everybody.
Susie, you're absolutely right. These things, there has to be some sort of sticks, but there has to be some incentives there. One of the incentives is it protects the agent with their legal duty, but it also allows them to sell a property or to rent a property more better, really, because they've got more information and they can target the customer towards the best property for the buyer or for the seller or the landlord.
And hopefully it will presumably mean that people, because they have all of that information up front, then they won't be backing out of things later down the line when they discover that information and find that it isn't aligned with what they actually want.
Absolutely correct. And I deal with a lot of complaints when if I'd known that, I wouldn't have, so. Yeah. Let's see how we go. It's we're not there yet, but we're making big progress on it.
And I'm going to quote one of the things that you said in one of your previous blogs at you, just to see whether you still think that it's aligned. So last July, you said that consumer protection regulations require material information disclosure, and this clearly should include building safety. So obviously building safety has been quite a hot topic for a while. Do you think that this is something which has been fully covered in the plans so far, the projected parts A, B, C?
Yes, to be fair, building safety it's taken a long time to get this far, hasn't it, really? Once we had that tragedy and once it became obvious that some buildings, especially high-rise buildings, were not fit for purpose, it's been quite a very long and for some people very painful journey to get to where we are at the moment, not least because things are not put right cheaply, to be fair. This is going to cost an awful lot of money. And definitely, in my view, building safety and to be fair, all condition of property is a material fact that should be disclosed and should be monitored and should be of the highest standard. So yes, transparency and disclosure is one part of that, of which building safety will be a paramount importance.
And in terms of agents who are having to prepare for this, obviously, in theory, they should know things like the rent and all of the, these essential pieces of information already. But how would you advise them to prepare for these changes that are coming in? Should they just it be a question of ensuring that all of their records are up to date to ensure that they're starting to collect this information now, so that then when parts B, C, etc. they do become mandatory, agents are fully prepared just to jump on board because they've got all of that information already? I mean, what tips could you give agents that are looking to prepare for that?
You're absolutely right. Is to keep your records up to date as much as possible. Remember that you have a duty to disclose, but also to make reasonable inquiries if you're getting information from a buyer or a landlord, to make sure that information is to the best of your knowledge, correct and accurate, or at least then, to highlight and warn a consumer that you don't have perfect information on that. We do realise that a lot of leasehold flats and are sold, and they have got freeholders and property managers behind them, and getting information out of them is not always as easy as it sounds. I know the government was looking at trying to make that information more readily available. You don't have to be an expert on fire safety, building safety, etc. You just have to make sure that the requisite forms and designations have been put into place, okay, and present them to the consumer as openly as you can do that. And I know that a lot of our agents are anxious out there because they're not experts, they're not surveyors, they're not building safety managers, and they don't have to be. They just have to be as open and transparent and provide as much information as they can to the consumer.
And I guess obviously there is some well, I don't know whether it's directly help, but there is some information out there to help direct. I think it's the buying and selling property information form, for example. I believe that's been updated recently or released recently, and that includes a lot of information. So it should give an idea, a bit of a steer in terms of what they can start looking into.
Absolutely. Now, of course, I think I said in my blog, it's very important that you give that information to a buyer, someone buying a property, but equally for renting, and the tenants that are renting properties in buildings that are subject to these requirements are going to need information about what it means to them. And they're not going to be that technical. That's the problem. They just want to know, is it safe to live in? And the other area I do say to agents is that, if you're renting out properties that could be subject to remedial work, please tell the tenant, because if they're going to be faced with disruption for 6, 8, 12 months of their tenancy, they're not going to be very pleased with that, just from a noise and an inconvenience point of view, not least the fact that, the building is being brought up to safe measure, but you've got to take that into consideration as well. So, I do understand that agents will find this challenging, but help and guidance has to be there. And we've been pushing all along for the government to provide as much help, support and guidance, especially for agents and property managers as possible. And, let's just hope that we've now turned the corner and we can move forward with this.
And perhaps just to round off this part of the podcast, you've already mentioned that for consumers, it is something that they're asking for. It is something that or at least something that they agree with. Have you received positive feedback from the rest of the industry? I mean, from agents and so on. Do they recognise that this is in place to help them? Obviously, the fact that there are benefits and so on.
Well, to be fair, and this is one of the things that has come out of the working group. Most agents are providing most of what is going to be required. There are few gaps for most of the people that are operating out there. Your property mark agents and other ones there are providing that information. Therefore, it's now just basically for most agents, it's having the reassurance and the guidance that they are doing the right thing. For those that are not providing that, we've got to say, well, are these the sort of people that we want to see operating? We know that portals, since they've been brought in, have been subject to some abuse, portal juggling, for example, various other kind of little practices that some agents believe give them a competitive advantage. So this will level the playing field, dare I say it. And those agents that are complying and have complied and will comply with the new regulations can, rest easier that there aren't people breaking the rules and trying to get a competitive advantage by manipulating the portal system. So let's wait and see, but I think most will welcome it. There will always be kind of controversial areas where people will say, well, that's going too far or not. But on the whole, I think we've had a very measured approach to the rollout of this.
Well, that's good to hear, and I think that that's a good transition into the next part of the podcast, where we will look a little bit at redress. But before we dive into that, I think we can take a quick break.
Are you always worrying about compliance at your agency and just want it off your plate? Well, that's one of the things Goodlord's here to help you with. From sending the How to Rent guide and attaching property certificates, to taking the right deposit amounts and sending prescribed information, we'll help you take care of lettings compliance all in one place. Head to goodlord.co to check compliance off your to-do list. Goodlord, it's just that good.
So now let's turn and take a look at the redress side of this podcast that I promised at the beginning. Obviously, redress, or sort of stronger redress for tenants, this was included in or mentioned in the Levelling Up white paper. So, but I know that it's something that you've been involved in a redress pilot that's currently underway. I mean, What is that all about? What does that include? How are you currently working to get this pilot throughout the process of setting up this pilot and so on?
Well, the reason we're setting up the pilot is that for 3, 4, maybe even longer years, the government's been promising to reform the rental sector. And one of the areas that was very clear was providing a non-court-based redress process for tenants. They sorted out redress in terms of landlords and tenants in terms of agents, but the big gap was landlords. And we know that although a good number of landlords use agents, not all of them do, and some only use agents for a limited amount of their transaction of the process. So they will use it for let only or rent collect and property manage it, or they will self-manage completely. So the whole idea the government has said is they will bring in landlord redress as a mandatory requirement for all landlords to provide that to their tenants. That will square the circle and close the gap that all tenants will be protected in some form of redress. However, the devil is always in the detail. And I've sat at round tables, we sat at consultations. Ben Beadle, who is the CEO of the National Residential Landlord Association, who we are doing this pilot with, went and he sat in front of all the civil servants and MPs to give evidence. And the reality is that we sat down and said to ourselves, well, it's great to talk. It's great to talk about things in theory. But if you do something in practice and you can show the results of it, that's far, far more powerful. Why don't we run a pilot? We know how to do redress. We know somebody who knows landlords. So ourselves and the NRLA, and slightly later on, TDS, one of the deposit schemes, came on board and said, look, well, let's run a pilot. We will do that with the members of the NRLA, so it's not going to be an open pilot to all landlords. But if we use those landlords that are members of the NRLA, we can have a look at how this is going to work in practice, what mechanisms we would need to put into place, what its success rates are, and the pitfalls and the benefits of it. So we have now got around about 5,000 people signed up to us. To be fair, we have had 3 complaints put forward to us, which we have been unable to deal with because they are actually to deal with the agent. So we have signposted them to the appropriate redress scheme for that. But we are hopeful that by doing this, we will basically iron out a lot of the problems that could emerge from a scheme set up on paper, but that doesn't know how it's going to work in reality. That's where we are with the pilot.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, obviously having 5,000 people already jumped in and starting to use it, it seems that it's already, the idea itself already seems to work, or at least attract landlords that obviously don't seem to have an issue with using it at this stage. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yes, to be fair, that is absolutely the situation. To be fair, the NRLA have been very good, and they have offered it to their landlords for nothing at the present moment. Saying that, in my estimation, and you can quote me back a few years from now when it is actually mandatory, I don't think it's going to be prohibitively expensive to run a scheme in the first instance, because there are about 2.5 million landlords out there, and ultimately, if you spread the costs of all of this over the whole of the sector, and given that relatively it's around about 5% of landlords, of agents at the moment who have a lot of complaints, you're going to have similar numbers. So I think this is also going to show how effective this can be, and cost effective as well as being a really good thing for the industry. So it's really good that they've come on board, and I know these are people who have joined a voluntary organisation to be better, so are not going to be the worst of the landlords. But I think we will still be able to learn an awful lot of lessons from this.
That's perhaps a slight tangent, but it seems that what you've gone away and done is realise that these reforms have been on the horizon for a fair amount of time now. And you do seem to have looked at it and said, right, okay, how can we push this forwards, but in the right way, in the right direction? I mean, how important is it for agents, lettings professionals and landlords and so on to get involved in these conversations? And what is the scope for them to be able to do that?
We've engaged ever since we've known that the reform agenda has been on the cards, and reached out to to landlords and to letting agents, and yes, and tenants. A lot of landlords and agents have actually engaged with the process already, and that is really positive. But I'm going to be honest and say that for some out there, it doesn't matter how many messages we put out, how many lovely articles we put out on the brilliant Good Lord Newsagent. They are not going to engage until they are absolutely forced to do so. So I do realise that, but so far it is so important that those who have engaged do engage, because we can iron out the unforeseen consequences early. We can make it work for the industry as well as protect the consumers. So you've got that virtuous situation where the customer and the provider are in a mutually beneficial relationship, and the legislation ties up to help protect both sets of the parties. So yes. But yes, there is still going to be people that it's all going to be a big surprise when it all goes mad this degree. So.
Yeah, no, I suppose that there is quite a lot changing. So when there's that much changing, it really does need to be. It will be quite difficult to ensure that everybody's on board and knows about them before it happens. So there are always going to be these people that fall through the net. Just to move on, perhaps onto your annual report. I know that that came out recently, so it seemed good timing to touch on that as well, just to see what kind of highlights there were in that. Perhaps if you'd like to go through and just give us a bit of an overview, really, as new conclusions and things that arose from that.
Well, we've got out our annual report earlier than ever before. Would you believe it? So we've run a year which is April to April, and we've literally got the report out with all the statistics. It wasn't even the end of April, so we've got it out in weeks of actually our results actually coming through, which I think is very, very useful, because it means that this information is as up to date and fresh as you can get it. What's the highlights? Well, our membership has grown, and it's grown almost 9%. And given that, what I observed was that a lot of people exited the market, a lot of agents exited the market, more came in. So it's a net 9%. Okay, and we're over 16,000 members there, but the pandemic did show that some, the water was too hot for some agents, and some agents have left the sector, but a lot have come in, and more have come in to replace them. What has that meant in terms of complaints? Well, complaints have gone up. If your membership goes up, your complaints go up, but proportionately to their membership, they haven't gone up as much as it did the previous year. And although complaints are coming in, less of those complaints are being upheld. So we are finding that that although awareness and complaints are going up, that the agents are not to blame in a lot more cases. So usually if a complaint comes through and goes through our processes, it's usually for a reason. But we found that more complaints that have been coming in are not the fault of the agent. Now, that means partially that some of that might be down to landlords, which is why landlord redress is so important. But it also, I think, shows that the industry is taking its role very seriously, and it is a professional sector for the most part. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's that way, and we have seen a number of areas where complaints have increased quite dramatically. Part of that is to do with the pandemic. So the one that we've mostly seen is the rent-to-rent sector, and complaints on the rent-to-rent sector have, are the main area where we've had an increase in complaints, and that is because the rent-to-rent model was put under severe pressure by the pandemic. If you've got tenants in your property that are not paying rent, or you are not able to rent out properties under the rent-to-rent model, you still have the legal obligation to pay your landlords, but you aren't getting an income in. So you can imagine that has caused pressures for those agents undertaking that model. So we wait to see how that pans out now that we're out of a pandemic, but we still have quite a lot of rent arrears, and I still have a lot of reservations about that model in terms of its regulation and in terms of how it's controlled, and the competence of people that of some agents are in that sector. So rent to rent is something I'm going to be looking at. I've raised that with both government and national trading standards, and I think you'll hear more of that as we go along. Another area which was quite interesting and saw a number of an increase in complaints is virtual viewings, and people claiming that they did not get to see the property, especially during the pandemic. So they viewed it in inverted commas by video online, and when they got to the property, it wasn't what they thought it was, and they alleged that they'd been missold it, or it wasn't what they expected. So we saw during the pandemic a rise in virtual viewings across the industry, and a lot of innovative products that came out. And there is still a lot of virtue in a modern virtual viewing arena there, in terms of engaging with far more prospective renters or buyers in the initial stages. But our advice has always been that when you get down to the hard cash, the hard transaction, the person who is entering into that transaction should at all encouraged to go and see the property and view it themselves. I will give you one little case study that we have had very recently, and this was a basement flat being advertised for rent. It was viewed virtually, using a panoramic video thing, and on the video it represented the property. It was a good quality. It didn't kind of selectively hide bits of it. However, when tenants and they paid all the upfront fees, and when the tenant picked up the keys and moved into the property, they discovered that the flat ceiling was only 2 meters high, and he was 1.9 meters high. It was 6'5" and he was 6'3". He wasn't very happy, and then therefore decided that he wasn't going to take the flat. So we've had that issue of him signing a contract, being in breach of contract, but was he missold? Can he pull out? All of these things there. So those are the sort of things that are not disclosed if you necessarily on a virtual platform, and the other methods of kind of communicating information is needed. So I am not saying that virtual viewing is not a positive thing, but it has to be taken into context that ultimately, if the consumer has not physically viewed the property, you're going to have to make some provisions for the fact that they need extra information to make a material decision.
No, especially for something like that, it wouldn't necessarily be something that you'd anticipate needing to ask about whether you'd fit into, that particular case study, whether you fit into the flat or not. That one is quite an unusual one, I would have thought.
Yeah, these are the sort of things we deal with on a daily basis. Yeah,
exactly. But I suppose that if you use it as this technology as a means to filter tenants and make sure that they're really interested in the property before you then go on to actually view it in person, then it can still help save time. It can still be beneficial, but as you say, it can perhaps avoid those misunderstandings which weren't deliberate, but can perhaps happen.
yeah.
Just to quickly just look back at this idea of the rent-to-rent sector as well. Just do you think that those particular the pressures that have perhaps been highlighted by the pandemic, do you think that this will deter agents from utilising that model in the future going forwards, or do you think it will just perhaps need a bit of a consideration around it, more consideration in how it's used in the future?
I think that those agents that have been burnt by it will not use it again. But unfortunately, it's still a very attractive model out there for a lot of people wanting to get into property. And again, it touches on to a campaign that my good friend Paul Champolina of Landlord Action, along with other people like Vanessa Warwick and others, are on property sources and property educators. The HMO and the rent-to-rent models are very popular models to encourage people to get into property investment because it's low capital and high yield on the whole. So you don't actually have to buy your own property as a rent-to-renter. You just have to find the tenants and manage the properties and as long as you're paying the person that owns the property, then it's a good model in terms of of getting into the property world. But if you don't have the due diligence, you don't have all the other kind of protections that you need on this, or you don't understand or don't want to understand that you are have that financial risk and that financial responsibility, then that's where it goes wrong. Rent to rent as a model, if it's done absolutely properly, is a very, very good way of getting into property. If you don't know what you're doing, or that you are not particularly ethical in what you are doing, then it is a very, very bad model. So that's my view on it, and I'm there to support any further regulation and campaign to increase standards in that area.
Well, those are certainly some very interesting results from the past year, especially around the idea of, the fact that your data would seem to suggest that the industry at large is moving towards this idea of professionalisation, despite the fact that the regulation of property agents hasn't come in yet. It seems to be moving that way on its own, perhaps pushed by the fact that these will be coming in, but it's nice to hear that is the direction of travel at large. Well, just to round off our conversation, I will caveat this question with the fact that the Queen's speech is in a couple of weeks' time, and the fact that we haven't yet had the white paper for the Renters Reform Bill, and that has been promised and it's sort of there on the horizon. We're just waiting for those further details. But in terms of some of these reforms actually becoming law, legal requirements, especially around reform, and obviously the other things that come under the umbrella of the Renters Reform Bill, abolishing Section 21, etc. What kind of timelines do you think that we're looking at there? Assuming that we do still get this white paper in the spring, what would be the earliest that you suspect that the legislation will actually come into force?
Well, I think it's going to have to be done in tranches, in stages. Because it's a big piece of work. B, it's quite complex. Some of the areas, especially the abolition of no-fault evictions, which it sounds very simple to get rid of Section 21, but then what do you do with court reform, Section 8, bailiffs, courts? The whole thing there is a lot more complex than people realise. That project needs to start. But I think where they will go, and you've always got to look at this politically. At some stage, all politicians have to go to the people, to the polls, and we know we've got an election in 2 years' time. I think they will be looking at a register So a landlord register, that's not licensing or registration, it's a register. And on the back of that, landlord redress. I think they are going to be the two starting points. The other reforms, I think, will take a little bit longer. So I would say, I think, because they have done this feasibility study that they're undertaking, I'm trying to find out more about this project that they've done. I think that they could get, if they could get the legislation through quickly, and when we mean quickly for parliamentary terms, that's a year. I think you could see a register as soon as next year sometime, probably late next year, and with landlord redress on that, especially if our pilot goes really well. And then I think the legislation will then allow a provision for the introduction of the Section 21 reforms and the court reforms. Now, whether the political and public will tolerate the government not having delivered the abolition of Section 21 by the time they go to the polls is a factor. So I would say that might be a stick to beat the current government with, that they promised and never delivered in the Parliament, and they've pushed it into the next Parliament. But I certainly think they have listened and realised that it is not as simple just to remove no fault possessions without looking at the whole process of possessions, evictions, courts, everything else. So that's as far as I'm going to say at the moment. I no doubt will be proved wrong.
Well, I know I perhaps put you on the spot with the question, but even if it's just to know that it's not going to be, at the end of this year or whatever, I realise that very few people would really expect that. But it's nice just to get a bit of an idea. And I'm sure that when further details are released in this white paper, whenever that may be, then we'll be able to perhaps refine those timelines a bit more. But that's great then. Well, thank you ever so much, Sean, for joining me today on this podcast. It's been a really interesting conversation. I think it's good to get that overview out there about material information and the different stages, what agents are going to have to prepare for that, and as well as obviously looking at redress and how that's going in terms of the pilot and where we think that could be going in the future. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Susie, and thank you for all the things that Good Lord are doing with Newsagent in spreading the news and giving the information to everybody out there in the industry. So thank you.